They say that certain names remain in the archives not because they were remembered, but because no one could forget them. The sisters of Ashen Hollow, Eleanor and Miriam Hargrove, are part of that rare kind of memory that spans decades like a burning ember under the ashes. Before we begin, the narrator asks viewers to leave a comment stating which city they are watching from and what time it is there now. After that, the story unfolds on its own, like the silent records that have been resting for over a century in the vaults of Smoky Ridge County. The oldest documents about the sisters date back to the winter of 1897, when they moved to the region from Harper's Creek, a village that, at the time, was already losing inhabitants to the factories in the south. Eleanor was 34, and Miriam was 31. Both were described in testimonies as women with calm countenances, austere in their speech, and discreet in their way of life. At a time when female solitude aroused curiosity, they seemed to simply occupy the world without asking permission, and without offering explanations. Ashen Hollow, where they took up residence, was nothing more than a sparse collection of cabins and barns hidden in the foothills. The local fog was known to linger until noon, covering pastures, fences, and trails with a milky layer that seemed to immobilize time. The sisters' house, built of dark, unadorned boards, stood on the edge between the village and the sloping woods that rose toward Smoky Ridge. A loft in the attic, known to local families as the Night Trials Loft, would be mentioned repeatedly in later accounts, almost always with the same silent hesitation. Residents described Eleanor as methodical, someone who measured her words like someone measuring flour before baking bread. Miriam, on the other hand, was more outgoing, though never completely open. She observed a lot and smiled little. The children liked her, perhaps because of her habit of carrying small objects in her pocket, an old button, a copper coin, a strip of leather, which she would occasionally offer as gifts. There was something maternal about her gesture, even though she herself never had children. The community, made up of farmers, hunters, and woodcutters, accepted the sisters without enthusiasm, but without resistance. They were women who worked, paid for what they consumed, and asked little in return. But the Smoky Ridge region was a place that was easily suspicious and spoke even less. The presence of two sisters living alone so close to the woods fueled small comments that never became official rumors, but also never disappeared. The year 1902, however, would record something that no resident, chronicler, or sheriff could clearly explain. 32 travelers would disappear within 4 months, all en routes near the valley between Ashen Hollow and the beginning of the Smoky Ridge Trail. Men, women, an itinerant reverend, 2 firewood merchants, a couple of cousins trying to reach Knoxville, all disappeared into the fog, as if swallowed not by the territory, but by time. In the archives, almost everything related to the early searches seems fragmented, as if someone had torn out certain pages only to put them back later without bothering to maintain the order of events. One of the only intact parts refers to a brief, unsigned note found on the deputy sheriff's desk in May of that year. The sisters saw something last night. They don't want to talk. There is fear in their house. No one knows for sure who wrote this observation, nor why it was preserved while so many other details disappeared. But it is this sentence that closes the initial section of the records and inaugurates what has since come to be called the Night Proofs Files. And it is here, precisely in this solitary and almost faded note, that the mystery begins. Because Eleanor and Miriam, as far as anyone knew, were never given to fears. And if they did indeed witness something that night, no subsequent document reveals what it might have been. It only indicates that from that point on, everything would slowly begin to fall out of alignment, like an old photograph being touched by time. And even though a century has passed, that little phrase, "there is fear in their house," remains the point at which any researcher is forced to stop, because it is the first sign that the sisters of Ashen Hollow were already, in some way, involved in what was yet to come. Mini cliffhanger. The archives indicate that, days after this note, a specific and deeply strange detail would be recorded for the first time, suggesting that the sisters were being watched. Before the disappearances, before the first patrols and the disjointed notes that now populate the Smoky Ridge archives. The Hargrove sisters' lives followed a slow, almost monastic course. Reports from the time describe a regular, even rigid daily life, marked by routines that rarely changed. Eleanor always woke up before first light. The neighbors who lived closest to them said that even in the thick fog, it was possible to hear the rhythmic sound of the axe splitting wood. 3 strokes, pause, 2 strokes, pause. This exact pattern was repeated every morning, as if it were a kind of silent prayer. She kept a small orchard behind the house, tending to the apple trees with a precision that many associated with some kind of discipline inherited from childhood. Miriam, on the other hand, had a greater appreciation for indoor tasks. She swept the loft floor twice a day and reorganized the objects in the kitchen with a care reminiscent of someone trying to keep the world under control, piece by piece. However, there was one detail that appeared repeatedly in the testimonies of those who lived with her. Miriam spent a lot of time by the attic window, watching the trail that wound its way into the woods. No one knew exactly what she was looking for there, but her posture, always the same, leaning, attentive, suggested more than simple curiosity. The community of Ashen Hollow was small enough that every habit was noticed, but large enough that no one felt responsible for asking too many questions. There was decorum in distance. The sisters had sporadic interactions. They bought flour and salt at Willis Carter's store, occasionally left baskets of apples for the McAdams family, and on rare occasions attended services at the small makeshift church in Reverend Doyle's log cabin. The earliest accounts reveal that the family dynamics between the two sisters never aroused suspicion. There were no signs of fighting, excesses, or apparent tensions. They spoke softly, made decisions together, and moved around the house as if they had learned to share silence from an early age. However, in statements collected only decades later, some witnesses claimed to have noticed something subtle: Eleanor's excessive care for her sister, as if she wanted to protect her from something she never named. And it was precisely during the first quarter of 1902 that this behavior began to become more pronounced. Miriam, according to reports from the local seamstress, began to avoid going to the village alone. When she needed to buy fabric, she waited for Eleanor. When she delivered embroidery, she did so quickly, as if an invisible rush were surrounding her. None of this appears in official documents, but it came up in the words of the elders in the years when researchers began to investigate the disappearances. The region's climate also seemed to contribute to this growing unease. The Smoky Ridge fog arrived early that year, covering the valley with an unusual thickness. Hunters mentioned the difficulty in finding trail markers, and travelers passing through the region reported a feeling of disorientation. Not fear, but a peculiar kind of spatial confusion. When the fog descended completely, certain sounds seemed to travel deceptively. A breaking branch might sound close when it was far away. Horse hooves might echo as if coming from 2 directions at once. These details, at first glance merely curious, would take on another meaning after the disappearances began. But at the time, they were just part of the landscape. In one of the few notes preserved in the diary of one of the residents, a woodcutter named Thomas Nill, there is a seemingly common observation, but one that would be cited repeatedly in the years to come. The sisters were different today. I asked if Miriam was okay. Eleanor squeezed her arm before she answered. But Miriam didn't seem sick. She seemed tired of something I can't describe. This phrase echoes in several later accounts, always with minor variations. Tiredness, distraction, restlessness. As if Miriam knew something she couldn't, or didn't want to, put into words. The following months recorded small changes that, in isolation, would seem irrelevant, but together form an uncomfortable pattern. Eleanor locked the front door even during the day, something unusual for the region. The lights in the loft remained on until late, and the sisters' presence at Sunday services began to dwindle. Still, there was no indication of a concrete threat. They were just 2 women living a simple life in a territory that, in itself, already carried the sobriety of the time. But the archives show something that almost always goes unnoticed. Starting in March 1902, the number of travelers using the Smoky Ridge Trail increased due to traffic between neighboring counties. Traveling merchants, small farmers, families on the move, all crossed the region more frequently that year, and it was precisely during this increase in traffic that the first disappearance, that of a young seed salesman, would occur. But before that, there is a unique record, little understood by researchers, found in a letter from a local resident. Yesterday, at dusk, I saw someone standing in front of the sisters' house. When I called out, they did not answer. When I looked again, they were no longer there. The document ends without describing who this person was. No explanation, no continuation. Mini cliffhanger. Days after this report, the sisters' routine would undergo a decisive change, and the archives suggest that Miriam, for the first time, confided to someone what she had been fearing. In the records preserved in the county archives, the sequence of events between March and May 1902 could never be reconstructed with complete accuracy. Still, by gathering testimonies, letters, and incomplete reports, a plausible outline emerges. A map of shadows that allows us to understand, at least partially, how the disappearances began and how the Hargrove sisters were gradually drawn into the center of this enigma. The first officially documented disappearance was that of the young seed salesman, Jonathan Lorne, aged 26. He was last seen on March 14th, when he left the village at dusk for the neighboring county, pulling a small cart loaded with burlap sacks. According to the McAdams family, the young man passed in front of their house shortly before nightfall, always polite, always in a hurry. The trail he chose, a fork to the left, running parallel to the foot of the mountain, was known to be safe, even for those traveling alone. But Jonathan never reached his destination. The wagon was found 2 days later, empty, leaning against a broken fence. The horse, tied to a tree just above the trail, was alive, restless, but showed no signs of attack or injury. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no clues as to what might have happened. For county authorities, it was an unusual disappearance, but one that was initially treated as an accident, possibly due to disorientation in the fog. However, something relevant appears in the sisters' statements. According to a witness, whose name was removed from the main document and replaced with a dark stripe, on the night of Jonathan's disappearance, Miriam had gone down to the village alone before Eleanor noticed her absence. The witness reported that she seemed anxious, as if she were looking for someone she expected to find there. There is no clear explanation for this behavior. The episode appears only as a loose fragment, without justification or direct continuation. With the second disappearance, however, a pattern began to form. On April 2nd, a family of 3, father, mother, and teenage niece, was reported missing after failing to arrive at their lodgings in Smoky Ridge. They had left at dawn, carrying only light luggage. The trail they chose was the same one used almost daily by residents to fetch firewood or cross over to the other village. There was no reason for concern until night fell without any news from them. The first searches were conducted by local volunteers. With each testimony collected, an uncomfortable detail emerged. No one remembered hearing voices, animals, or unusual noises that day. No hunters reported movement in the woods. No additional carriages were seen passing by. It was as if in broad daylight the group had disappeared without disturbing the environment, a practical impossibility that nevertheless remained recorded as fact. Over the following weeks, the disappearances continued, always without warning, always without a visible pattern. Among merchants, travelers, and small farmers, 32 people would go missing in the region in less than 4 months. The community entered a state of unrest. Doors that had previously been left open began to be locked. Stoves remained lit until later. People stopped crossing the trail at dusk, and children were forbidden from playing near the woods. The fog, which had always been part of the landscape, became suddenly and deeply threatening. It did not change in appearance, but it changed in meaning. And it is in this context that the sisters' position becomes central to the records. Beginning in April, Eleanor and Miriam are mentioned with increasing frequency in statements, not as suspects, but as unwitting witnesses to disconnected elements. The first of these is described in a document signed by Police Chief Roderick Ames. According to the report, on April 11th at 9 p.m., Eleanor knocked on the police chief's door, carrying an unlit flashlight and a coat still damp from the fog. She stated that someone had passed by their house repeatedly, walking up and down the path as if marking the route. She did not describe the person's face, height, or voice. She only said, "He wasn't lost." This phrase has become one of the most studied by historians because it suggests that Eleanor recognized an intention, not just a presence. Miriam, on the other hand, provided even more enigmatic information. In a statement taken 3 days later, she said she had heard footsteps in the attic the night before Eleanor's visit to the sheriff. Slow, rhythmic footsteps, as if someone were walking among the boxes and old furniture stored there. When she went upstairs to check, she found only the empty loft, lit by a dim lamp and a sliver of light coming from the window facing the trail. This episode, known as the Loft Record, is one of the most controversial, as there is no physical evidence to confirm it. Yet the testimony appears in at least 4 different transcripts. The atmosphere of tension increased along with the feeling of silent surveillance that hung over the sisters' house. In the archives, there are several references to the nights of those months. They describe the wind dragging dry leaves on the porch, the creaking of old boards under temperature changes, the distant sound of something, unidentified, unnamed, moving among the trees. These descriptions seem to have been compiled from multiple testimonies, and although none prove any concrete threat, they all carry the same tone. The perception that someone, or more than one person, knew the region's paths intimately. And then, in early May, the episode that marks the climax of the narrative in the documents occurred: the disappearance of Reverend Doyle. The Reverend was known to walk frequently between villages, bringing prayers, news, and food. He knew the trail well, better than most residents. However, on May 3rd, he did not arrive at the scheduled service in the neighboring village. The search began that afternoon and continued into the early hours of the morning. His Bible was found lying on the side of the trail, open to an irrelevant page. Further on, his hat was found stuck between 2 bushes, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. The sisters were questioned, not as suspects, but as residents located in the critical passage area. And it was during this interrogation that one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence in the entire file emerged. Eleanor reported seeing the Reverend the night before his disappearance, walking toward their house. According to her, he seemed hurried, but not frightened. When she waved, he raised his hand in response. But seconds later, when Eleanor looked again, he was no longer there. The trail was empty. The fog was low. The silence was absolute. This testimony is particularly important because it contains the last confirmed witness of the Reverend before his disappearance. However, it is what happens the following night that forms the true climax of the documents. In the early hours of May 4th, around 3:30 a.m., the sisters' house recorded an unusual event. Deputy Ames wrote in his report that Miriam, in a state of deep nervousness, arrived knocking on the police station door with the lamp still lit. She claimed that someone had tried to enter the house, not through the front door but through the loft, through the small window where she used to stand to watch the trail. The wood of the doorframe, she said, was chipped. The curtain was displaced. The air was heavy, as if someone had been there minutes before. When the police chief and 2 assistants arrived at the house, they found the sisters together, sitting at the kitchen table, hands clasped. Eleanor was pale but lucid. Miriam was trembling. The men went up to the loft and found that indeed the window showed recent marks. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been left behind. Only the silent trace of a presence. The sheriff's report ends the section with a brief sentence: "Whoever it is, they know the loft, and they know the sisters." From that moment on, the documents become sparse, confusing, filled with marginal notes and missing pages. But there is one last record that precedes the most intense search ever conducted in Smoky Ridge. At 5:17 a.m. that same morning, someone, whose identity has never been revealed, left a small folded note on the sisters' kitchen table. The transcript contains only one sentence: "They weren't the first." Mini cliffhanger. This note would be the last confirmed evidence before the disappearance of the Hargrove sisters themselves. The note found on the table, "They weren't the first," became the turning point that would reorganize the entire investigation. Until then, despite the disorder in the archives, the county believed it was dealing with a series of recent disappearances limited to the months of 1902. But that phrase suggested continuity, perhaps years of discrete occurrences that were never formally recorded. The community's reaction was immediate. Families began sleeping with lamps lit throughout the night. Travelers stopped crossing Smoky Ridge. Merchants cancelled entire routes. The trail that had once been the link between villages became an avoided, almost forbidden space. The fog, previously ignored as a natural phenomenon, came to be perceived as part of the problem, not because it had changed, but because it reminded everyone that there was something in the region that was impossible to see completely. The Hargrove sisters' house, until then a simple dwelling among many, became the unwitting center of the case. Sheriff Ames ordered informal surveillance around the property, carried out by men from the village who took turns in 3 shifts. The intention was not to suspect the sisters, but to protect them, considering that they had somehow become key witnesses, and perhaps targets. The statements collected in the following days reveal a mixture of solidarity and fear. Some women offered food to the sisters, but left the baskets on the porch, avoiding entering the house. The men of the village spoke little when they approached the house, preferring to talk to Eleanor, who was more assertive. Miriam rarely came downstairs. She spent most of her time in the loft, as if trying to decipher something that the window insisted on not showing. A report dated May 6th records that Deputy Ames spoke with the sisters for over 2 hours that morning. In the transcript, his main question is repeated several times in different forms. "What did you see?" But the answers remain vague. Eleanor mentions footsteps. Miriam talks about the feeling of being watched. Both confirm the attempt to enter the attic. Still, no concrete details emerge. It is as if they know only fragments, enough to generate fear, insufficient to illustrate a complete situation. Residents began to develop their own theories. Some believed that itinerant thieves were using the fog to hide. Others suspected conflicts between neighboring families. A smaller group feared that the trail had become an escape route for criminals. None of this, however, explained the total absence of traces in the disappearances, nor the silent presence recorded by Miriam and Eleanor. It is at this point that the most sensitive revelation in the archives emerges, not about what was happening, but about what had already happened. In one of the oldest documents recovered from the police station attic, there is a statement by a man named Walter Briggs, collected 5 years earlier, in 1897. He reports the disappearance of his younger brother in the same region of Smoky Ridge, describing similar circumstances. Intact wagon, preserved personal belongings, absence of tracks. The case was never investigated because, at the time, Briggs was not a permanent resident of the county, and with no family to insist on an investigation, the report was shelved. This document, forgotten until 1902, confirmed that the disappearances were not a recent event. The phrase on the note, "They were not the first," took on greater significance. The sisters' fear came perhaps not from the unknown, but from the certainty that this was not a new phenomenon. Based on this revelation, the community organized the largest search ever recorded in the county's history at that time. More than 40 men combed through extensive areas of the forest. They used dogs, flashlights, ropes, and markings on tree trunks. For 3 days, they searched everywhere: rock crevices, ravines, secondary trails, old abandoned cabins. But, as in previous cases, nothing was found. In the records, there is a passage written by Sheriff Ames himself, possibly at the end of this frustrated search. There are no signs of struggle, escape, passage, or life. There is silence, only silence. It is as if we were searching not for people, but for gaps. On the 4th day of the search, new evidence emerged, and its origin remains one of the most debated points among modern historians. On a fallen log, less than 200 meters from the sisters' house, a white handkerchief was found, folded twice, perfectly clean despite the mud around it. On the fabric, there was only one letter embroidered by hand, M. Miriam confirmed that the handkerchief was hers, but she stated firmly that she had kept it in a box in the loft and had not used it for weeks. Eleanor supported this version. There was no way the handkerchief could have left the house without one of them noticing. This evidence, though small, changed the sisters' behavior. According to statements from neighbors, they began to stay together all the time. They cooked together. They slept in the same room. They only went out during daylight hours. The feeling of siege intensified around them, even though there was no formal suspicion of their involvement in the disappearances. It was at this point that Miriam made the most important revelation of the entire case, and, paradoxically, the most frustrating due to its lack of detail. In a statement taken on a grey afternoon on May 10th, she admitted that in the months prior to the first disappearance, she had already noticed strange people crossing the trail, always at dusk. People who seemed to avoid contact. People who changed their posture when they realized they were being watched. She tried to describe them, but her words were vague, as if her memories were shrouded in the same fog that covered the valley. Still, one specific phrase was preserved in 3 different transcripts, suggesting that Miriam spoke with rare precision. They knew where the loft was. This phrase, coupled with the silent attack on the window and the handkerchief found in the woods, led Detective Ames to conclude that the sisters had been watched for much longer than they realized. Perhaps they were the target. Perhaps they were unwitting witnesses. Perhaps both. And then, on May 12th, the final event before the sisters' disappearance took place. The night before, neighbors reported hearing voices coming from the direction of the Hargrove house. Voices that were subdued, as if people were talking while trying not to be noticed. One of the witnesses claimed to have seen 2 silhouettes at the top of the house near the loft. Another said they heard doors opening and closing. All descriptions are vague, but they converge on the same conclusion. Something was approaching. At dawn, when the sheriff and 2 residents knocked on the sisters' door, there was no answer. The door was just ajar. The kitchen was tidy. The table was set with 2 cups. The blankets were folded. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of a hasty departure. The loft, still cold in the morning, was lit only by the dim light coming through the window. And in all the transcripts, noted with the same precision, the police chief records, "They weren't there." Mini cliffhanger. On the doorstep, next to the entrance, there was something that no investigator could fully interpret. A second note, folded in 4, whose contents would forever change the understanding of the case. More than 40 years had passed since the Hargrove sisters disappeared when the case was re-examined with rigor. The files, which for decades had been stored in wooden boxes in the basement of City Hall, were reopened by a group of researchers from the State University. The paper, yellowed and brittle, carried the characteristic odor of documents that had survived longer than expected. Hastily written notes, partially erased reports, torn out and then replaced pages, statements that seemed to contradict each other. And yet, at the same time, all carried a silent inner truth that was difficult to ignore. Among these documents, one stood out not for its clarity, but for its lack of answers. The second note found on the doorstep of the sisters' house. Folded in 4, protected by a sheet of fabric, it was written in firm handwriting by someone determined to be understood, even if they remained invisible in the records. They understood too late. This note, unlike the first, carried no warning. It carried regret, or perhaps realization. But its meaning remains a subject of debate to this day because, as with the rest of the case, the precise context that could shed light on the phrase simply does not exist. No additional witnesses have come forward. No new clues have been recorded. The note is the last tangible piece of evidence of the sisters' existence before they disappeared without a trace. The case ended up acquiring a kind of second life in the collective memory of the county. Not because of the search for the 32 missing persons, although each name still appears, letter by letter, on a list preserved in the local archives, but because of the absent presence of the Hargrove sisters. It is as if their story had become the silent axis of the entire narrative, the lens through which every previous and subsequent event was reinterpreted. Decades later, when researchers revisited the Smoky Ridge area to collect late accounts, they found a transformed community. The once busy trail had become almost ceremonial. Few walked along it, and when they did, they spoke softly, as if disturbing something that should remain untouched. The sisters' house no longer existed. Only the outline of the foundations remained under the tall grass, like a mark erased by time. The loft, once the subject of speculation and vigilance, had disappeared along with the walls themselves. The oldest residents, however, still retained fragmented memories. Some mentioned seeing distant lights in the woods that last night. Others said they had heard footsteps or voices, although they could not say for sure whether the memories were real or constructed by so many decades of retold stories. An elderly woman reported that her mother used to talk about the heavy silence that hung over the valley in the days following the disappearance. A silence that was not only an absence of sound, but an absence of explanation. In examining these late accounts, the researcher responsible for the final report, whose name appears only as H.W. Clark, wrote a reflection that became famous among local historians. He stated that it was not the lack of answers that made the case so disturbing, but the way all the pieces seemed to align around something that never fully revealed itself. According to Clark, the weight of the unknown lies not in what we cannot see, but in what we know should be there and simply isn't. This sentence sums up the essence of the Ashen Hollow night trials. There are no records of a struggle. There are no interrupted tracks. There are no signs of escape. There is only the meticulous strangeness of objects that have been moved, marked windows, footsteps with no proven origin, displaced handkerchiefs, and notes left with precise intent. Above all, there is the perception that the sisters knew more than they could say, and less than they needed to know to protect themselves. An analysis conducted 42 years after the disappearance found an unattributed quote in the partially burned archives, probably written by one of the guards who took turns watching over the house in the last weeks before the disappearance. It simply says, they weren't waiting for someone, they were waiting for something. There is no context. There is no date. Just this sentence, standing alone, as if it belonged to a thought that was never completed. In modern debates, many attempt to reconstruct the sisters' psychology. Miriam, with her evident sensitivity, a tireless observer of the trail. Eleanor, firm, rational, silently protective. Some researchers suggest that Miriam's growing fear was not caused by the unknown, but by her inability to fully understand what she perceived. Others argue that Eleanor, in trying to rationalize what she saw, ended up undermining her own safety. But none of these hypotheses hold up beyond the interpretive field. The most widely accepted version among scholars is, paradoxically, the simplest. The sisters witnessed too much in a place where almost no one witnessed anything. They saw people who shouldn't have been there. They noticed presences that were too silent. They noted movements that others would ignore. And when they finally tried to share what they knew, it was too late, as the final note observes. Today we revisit the case as if listening to a distant echo. Time does not provide answers, it only preserves questions. And perhaps that is what makes the story of the Hargrove sisters so profound. They disappeared in the same way they lived, discreetly, restrainedly, almost imperceptibly, leaving only enough fragments behind to ensure they would never be completely forgotten. Closing the last page of the files, Clark wrote, "Some disappearances cannot be explained. They just repeat themselves silently, for those who dare to look back. And that is, perhaps, the definitive legacy left by the Sisters of Ashen Hollow, a silence that does not end, but continues. The last sentence should leave the viewer in silence. And to this day, even among the invisible ruins of the valley, there are those who say that the most disturbing thing about this story is not what was lost, but what never appeared."